All right, guys, welcome back to chapter 17. We again have Mr. Nichols awesomely volunteering to do the lovely audio recording for you guys. We appreciate you watching these. We appreciate you joining the Zoom meetings, and we just appreciate you guys sticking it out and trying through all of this craziness. So, without further ado, let's get chapter 17 started.
All right, guys, we are starting with chapter 17. These are the things that led up to the Civil War, the causes that lead to it. We've looked at all the history leading up, and this is strictly on those things. So let's get started. Why in the world are we going back clear to 1787 to start to talk about the things that lead up to the Civil War? If you remember the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, after the Revolutionary War was over, people were wanting to spread out into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and they went out there and they laid out squares 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles. And these squares that they did, the people could get, they had 640-acre plots, and everybody could get a plot. 1 square was left over for the schools out of the 36 squares of 640-acre plots. So how in the world would this have anything to do with the Civil War? Well, if you remember, when they did this, they added several things to it. And one of the things they added to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is that 1 square had to be used for schools. And the other thing they added is no territory in the Northwest Ordinance area, anything above the Ohio River, can have slavery. It has to be a free state. And in 1787, we went from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to the Mississippi River. So when this was written, this was perfectly fine. But what happens with Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, we now go from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Problem being with that is when we use a natural boundary like the Ohio River as the border for free states and slave states, now you're dealing with the fact that the Ohio River goes all the way up to Pittsburgh, but then all the way down to Kentucky. Which part are you going to draw the line west in to be able to say you can't have slavery above Pittsburgh, or you can't have slavery all the way down to Kentucky? So there's this massive gap of area because the only thing they said was no slavery above the Ohio River. The law says absolutely nothing about the West. And so once they head to where we now are making states, when we get to Missouri, which will be the first state out west, they immediately want to know, are we above or below the Ohio River line? And you know what? Part of their state is below, part of their state is above. So them not specifying, because we didn't realize we were going to go that far all the way back in 1787, leads to a big problem with Missouri. And now, as you can see, it shows the townships there. Miss Peak always does a fabulous job putting all this stuff in there. And you can see the little squares and how they came out and reserved for public schools. So I think that's neat. I love that she does that stuff. All right, so let's get to the Missouri Compromise. What happens is dealing with slavery, half of the nation doesn't want it, half the nation does. But the southern half who wants it, there's not the population living there. 38 of the 50 big cities at that time are up north. The north has the population. If you have the population, you own the House of Representatives. And so the fact that the North has more people packed into the House of Representatives, anytime something comes up with a deal with slavery, immediately the North will win that debate. The only thing the South has going for it is the fact of the Senate. The Senate is 2 per state. So as long as there's an equal number of free states and an equal number of slave states, they cannot pass a law to stop slavery or pass a law to make slavery legal. So the biggest thing is that fine line of keeping every state even so that the Senate never has to deal with slavery. Because the moment that they have more free states, you've already owned the House, you own the Senate, boom, it's shut down and it's a law. And we weren't trying to, But as America progressed, we kept adding one state, one state, one state, one state. They kept it exactly the same. In Vermont in 1791 wants to become a state. It's a free state. Well, the very next year, Kentucky, 1792, wants to become a slave state, and it joins as a slave. Balances equally. Ohio, 1803, wants to become a state, and has already, because of the Northwest Ordinance, it's a free state. 1796, I forgot real quick, Tennessee becomes a state. Y'all should know that. All right. 1796, Tennessee becomes, and then you've got 1812, Louisiana becomes a state. 1816, Indiana becomes a state. 1817, Mississippi becomes a state. 1818, Illinois becomes a state. So we keep having this competing boom, 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 boom to get up there. Well, what happens in 1819, Alabama wants to become a state, and the South is one state down. They let Alabama join, and now it's deadlocked in the Senate again. And then Missouri wants to join. Now you understand why the Missouri Compromise is going to have to happen. You've got an equal number of states, and if Missouri joins as a free state, slavery's dead. If it joins as a slave state, then there's no way of stopping slavery. And so these Southern senators, what they feared more than anything was losing voting power, because then whatever they wanted will be shot down in the Senate. So to add this, and once again, Missouri is, like I said, west of all this. So the first thing that happened is James Talmadge of New York. He comes up with a thing called the Talmadge Amendment, and he says states west of the Mississippi have to be free. Well, House says yes, Senate says no, because it's a tie. So Congress is at a deadlock. And then 1820, the Great Compromiser. All right, that is Henry Clay. Great Compromise is not what Miss Nichols did when she decided to date me. That was just a lack of morals right there. I mean, Henry Clay, if you remember, he does so many things trying to get president. He's hurting Andrew Jackson. He's bringing up the Bank of the United States. He does the deal with the trying to become Secretary of State. Henry Clay hurts us so much in politics, but there are a few times that Henry Clay is called the Great Compromiser, because he will just come up with this idea of how to keep everything equal and moving. And so Henry Clay comes up with the Missouri Compromise. And here is what the Missouri Compromise is. Are we ready? Missouri Compromise, that is it simply. Missouri will join as a slave state. That gives Missouri bonus right there, because that now the slave states have more numbers. So to keep it even, nobody's living up in Maine. Even today, nobody's living up in Maine. It's just this way state up there. In fact, what's interesting, the state of Maine, if you live there, you actually get your power and water from Canada, because you're closer to a Canadian power station than you are an American power station, which just lets you know Maine is just up there and out of the way for everybody. So if you let Missouri join as a slave, Maine join as a free, you keep your number the same, but the South is going to feel like they get some sort of victory, because they will get more in the House of Representatives. It's not going to change anything. It's kind of like Tellico shooting a three-point at the end of the game. Yes, you made a three-pointer, but you still lost 42 to 107. So, I mean, it doesn't matter that you get a little bit, but the North feels fine with that. In the South, they feel like they've accomplished something getting more in the House of Representatives. So once again, this keeps both sides happy, and he sets up a new thing, the 36-30 line. If you go to a picture of Missouri and you look at the map, the bottom of Missouri is the parallel 36-30. And so they said everything above 36-30 has to be free. Everything south of 36-30 gets to be slave. If you look at the map, you realize there's only a little bit south of 36-30, which eventually this would have taken care of the slave debate, because it would have ran out. But it's not going to get that far because we're going to have things come back up. So what here you can see on the thing, you can see in 1821, the 3630 Missouri Compromise line right there. You can see what was called the Arkansas Territory. And that's also going to be Oklahoma. Spain owns on to Texas at this time. So really, the only thing that you're going to be able to add slave rise is right there in Arkansas, Oklahoma area. This should take care of the slave problem, like we said, but it doesn't. Next slide. The other things that are going on at this time also that's going to push towards this, you have the Second Great Awakening help at this time. And remember, one of the things that the Second Great Awakening was talking about was that men are responsible for their own choices. And there's no way, if you are reading the Bible and your choice is to smack another person with a whip, that you can honestly look yourself in the mirror. It's not. The Second Great Awakening puts slavery on a moral thing. And morally, there's no good for slavery. At this time also, during the Missouri Compromise, you're going to see some other things come up that are going to think. The District of Columbia in 1836 comes up with an idea of adding slavery. So you had things like in the District of Columbia, right there in Washington, D.C. in 1836, they bring up the fact of, are we, even though we're not a state, are we allowed to be a slave territory or not? Congress at this time in 1836 decides to table it indefinitely, meaning nobody talk about it. And so in 1836, it becomes just a thing. Slavery is so ingrained, but you have the South and the North meeting there. They pass a thing saying it's a gag rule. No one can even talk about it. One thing we overlook in the history of the leading up to the war is what happened in 1839. John Quincy Adams actually comes up with what I think is the best plan to end slavery. It's in 1839. He says, time we get this passed, we'll be close to 1845. No one born after 1845 can be a slave. So if somebody had a slave that was born in 1844, they could be a slave up until the time they passed on. But if they would have had a child born in 1850, that child's free. And so what would have happened is you would have had from about 60 years out from 1845, by the time we would have got to 1905, there wouldn't have been any slavery left in the United States, and it would have phased itself out without going to war. John Quincy Adams comes up with this. I really think it was an amazing plan, because it would have slowly got rid out without causing a huge war. But what happens with this? The House says yes, Senate's deadlocked, and so it's a no. You're going to have several things also that during this time that are going to be pushing us towards a slavery towards the Civil War. Is you have in 1822, you have Denmark Vesey. He in South Carolina leads a free African slave revolt. And what happens with Denmark Vesey, he is actually a free African American, and he decides to let all the slaves know on a certain day they are going to all rise up, take down their slave owners, and set themselves free in South Carolina. Problem being, one of the slaves who had a good relationship with his owner told the owner, and that owner let all the slave owners know. And so they rounded up all those slaves, and they took and they hung Denmark Vesey, even though he's free, for coming up with this idea. But his idea in 1831 is going to be used by Nat Turner. Nat Turner comes up with a slave rebellion to where Nat Turner all of a sudden just realizes, you know what would set me free is hacking up the people that own me. And so he gets a hatchet, he goes into his owner's house and hacks him up. And then all of a sudden, when your owner is in pieces about that big, you know what? He can't tell you a lot to do. And so they went to the next plantation, started telling all those slaves, hey, if you hack up your owner, he can't do anything. And they hacked up their owner. And they went from house to house and house. It lasts for 2 days. They're going to end up killing 57 slave owners before a militia finally puts this down. But they get the idea from Denmark Vesey. Each time one of these things happens that we're talking about, it draws us closer and closer and closer to the war. So Get to what's on your screen. 1846. We are now at war with Mexico. This is the war that we're going to get Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, all those things in it. And the funding for the war, a bill funding the soldiers to be able to get blankets and horses and guns. David Wilmot adds this thing called the Wilmot Proviso. And what he does is he's writing up this big funding bill for all the states of what they're going to, all how we're going to help the soldiers and we're going to donate this and this. And then he adds the line at the very bottom that any land we get from Mexico has to be no slave, free territory. When he does that, if you remember the Missouri line, everything we're going to get from Mexico is under the 3630 line. So what David Wilmot just did was now everything north of Missouri has to be free. Everything south of Missouri has to be free. The South just lost. Unless they want to go to war, you just lost right here because you can't put that land back into the hands of the North. It's going to be free land at that point for free people. So the thing is, it's genius about this with David Wilmot. No one is going to vote against a war funding our soldiers. No one is going to vote against a bill that says give the soldiers some guns. And so by adding this at the bottom, he started a thing that they still do to this day in all the Congress and White House, But here, let's go on to the next one. So that gives you an idea of the 3630 line. And right there, you can see now what Arkansas is a state. The only thing that would have been Oklahoma. So Compromise of 1850. That leads us back to this. If you remember, in 1849, we talked about it last time, we had a gold rush. They find out there at Sutter's Mill, they find some gold. And in 1848, they find it. 1849, everybody goes rushing to California. Well, by 1850 now, you've got enough people living in California, they can become a state. That leads us right back to where we were with Missouri. Now we have to add another state. Is it free or is it slave? If it's slave, they're not going to be able to stop slavery. If it's free, they're going to shut slavery down for good. So once again, it is Henry Clay that comes to the rescue. Man has been in politics forever. He is the Miss Guerin of politicians. All right, so please don't tell Miss Guerin that joke, but you're going to anyhow. All right, so at this point, Henry Clay gets the nickname the Great Compromiser. Him and Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster, yes, that's the same guy who wrote Webster's Dictionary. Pretty smart guy when you can read the dictionary. Write the dictionary. Most of us can't even read the dictionary, and the dude writes the dictionary. So Daniel Webster is a genius. Him and Henry Clay get together, and with only one state wanting to join, the state of California, they've got their work cut out to be able to balance the interests of the North and the South and make everybody look at this thing and go, hey, that's exactly what we want. So they come up with the Compromise of 1850, and this is exactly what it is. California gets to become a free state. Now, the moment they say that, the South feels like, oh my goodness, we've lost. So it's 1 for the North, 0 for the South right here. Then New Mexico and Utah, those are below the 3630 line. And with the Wilmot Proviso, they get to be free states. So what Daniel Webster and Henry Clay come up with is New Mexico and Utah each get to decide for themselves if they want to be free or slave. The South thought they were going to have to be free. Now those are possibilities of being slaves. So it's like 1 for the North and 1/2 for the South. South still feels like they're lagging a little bit. So come to the third part. Slave trade is stopped in Washington, D.C. Now it's almost like 2 for the North and 1/2 for the South. So what they also say with it is slave trade is stopped. But if you are a senator or if you're passing through and you come through with a slave, that slave is still yours during that time. And they do not have the right to be free. You can't buy or trade them in Washington, D.C., but you can bring them to Washington, D.C. Now it's like 2 to 1 for the North and the South. So even though the North is getting the state, the South still feels like it's lagging here. So they pass the fourth part of it, they add on it, which is called the Fugitive Slave Law. The fourth part says that if a slave is caught up north, they have to, by law, return them to the South. This is going to save the South so much money because they spend huge amounts of money each year chasing down runaway slaves. There are whole people whose job are slave hunters to go up north and they look around and they find slaves and they bring them back down south. So if you pass a law saying anybody up north sees a slave, they've got to return them to the South feels like it's got to win, and now it's 2-2. Is what the score looks like. And so the compromise of 1850, by adding these things, these four things, it actually makes the North and the South both feel like they've won something from 1850. And so in 1850, they pass that law. The problem being, this did not work at all. All right. Here you go. You've got pictures of Henry Clay right there in the bottom left. Daniel Webster in the bottom right there. I love how Miss Peak is able to put all this stuff in there. You've even got a political cartoon right there showing Henry Clay trying to figure out how in the world to make this work. But the reason this did not work is the North, the part that is the win for the South is the fugitive slave law. It didn't work. The North, being told you have to return slaves, stepped up a notch to go the other way, to not return slaves. From 1850 to 1860, only 299 slaves are returned to the South from the North. We know more than that escaped. Harriet Tubman helped 300 escape. One lady took out 300. All that's returned is 299. So they are definitely on the minus side of returning slaves. They weren't returning them before, but they're definitely not returning them now. Slaves also kept going all the way to Canada. They now, instead of stopping in an area where you could get in trouble, the option is keep on going, move on all the way up north. And so Canada at this time starts to get more and more slaves going over that way. The thing I think it is funny is Northerners hounded the slave catchers. Now, Mr. Nichols, what in the world do you mean by hounded? You talk about the Sweetwater cheerleaders? No, hounded is something different than the hounds. Okay, once again, please don't get me in trouble for that joke. All right, so hounding somebody, if you've ever been hunting or anything like that, and you hear that dog, woo, woo, and then all of a sudden it gets a dog in a tree and it's woo, woo, and you know where to go find the coon if you're chasing it, right? Well, way you would hound a slave catcher, slave catchers would come into a town and there would be groups of northern people that would spend the whole day following the slave catcher around going, slave catcher, we got a slave catcher right here, slave catcher, slave catcher. There's no way they're going to be able to catch any slave with you've got this group of 20 people walking around you screaming out that you're a slave catcher. The only slaves that could have been caught were the deaf ones at this time because you could have heard anything. I mean, you would hear 20 people yelling, slave catcher, slave catcher. You left. So in the win from 1850 is they think they're going to get all their slaves returned. And then actually the slave catchers, pretty much the job starts breaking down because nobody's catching anybody. They are not returning anybody. The other thing that kicks up is the Underground Railroad. There already was an Underground Railroad, but it gets even more. The Underground Railroad is not underground, and it's not a railroad. It is a term for moving slaves from the Deep South up to the North and then all the way to Canada. They used railroad terms. You would have the guy that was in charge, the guy that drove the wagon, he'd be called a conductor. The houses would be called terminals, like a railroad terminal. You would talk about the packages and it being sent, and that would be the slaves and stuff. But what would happen is the Underground Railroad was a genius because if I was part of it, I don't know who's part of it. I know the guy below me and the guy above me. I don't know any more than that. What would happen is if I'm part of the Underground Railroad, at Middle of the night, somebody's gonna knock on my door. I go to the door and they give me like 4 slaves. I'm gonna hide those slaves in my house for a couple days until I think nobody's watching, because nobody came to the door thinking this guy dropped somebody off of my house. And when I think the coast is safe, one night when there's no stars or anything like that, I'm gonna take my wagon, put the slaves in the back, put hay over top of them so nobody can see it, and then I'm gonna drive to where I know the next stop on the railroad is. I don't know where the previous stop is. I just know the guy that comes to my house. I don't know any more than the next stop in front of me. And so if they would break down and find somebody part of the Underground Railroad, you could only crack that one chink in the armor. You could not take it all the way down because they didn't know where it went. And so the Underground Railroad really picks up of moving slaves to the north. When I lived in Ohio, the road nearest us and everything, we lived on Fancher Road, but right around the corner was a place called Africa Road. It got that name because so many people came up that road during the time of the Underground Railroad. The house across the street from us was built during that time and was built to be part of the Underground Railroad. It was a family farm. It was the Canes and everything. And their house, you could go upstairs and there was a secret room in one of the walls that you could only access from the basement, going up a secret set of staircases that was in the walls. They did actually have a little spot underground in the basement, but it was a thing behind a butcher block table that was just a place to hide them in case someone was coming in the house and they were being chased down. But most places had secret rooms, a secret outbuilding, someplace like that they kept the slaves until they felt they could move them to the next thing. And so when you try the Compromise of 1850, they start hounding the slave catchers. The slaves are moving to Canada, and the Underground Railroad picks up big time. So the Compromise of 1850 is a complete and total bust. Does not work at all. All right, so let's go to what happens in 1851. There's a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is written by a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book will cause so many people to turn against slavery. The people up north knew of slavery, don't know much about it other than it's immoral and it's wrong. This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is written by her. And you follow this slave named Tom, and his owner is named Simon Legree. Simon Legree is a jerk. He beats him. He's rude to him. He's just a jerk. But if you've ever read a book and you just fall in love with the character, and when the character hurts, you hurt. When the character's mad, you're mad. When the character's scared, you're scared. It's kind of like, for me, the book Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I get so involved into that. This book was so well written, you became involved into the book and your heart went out to it. And so as you were going through the story of Uncle Tom, there is a slave girl named Eliza, and she dreams of going up north and getting away from everything. And Eliza is helped by Uncle Tom to escape. He helps her figure out how to get out, and she takes off. That's the book so far. And at the very end of the book, the Simon Legree, the owner, finds out that Uncle Tom was part of setting Eliza free and getting her to escape. And so he has Uncle Tom hung up by his hands and whipped to death. And that's how the book ends. And it's one of those books that if you ever read a book and you get to the end, you're just like, oh, that was awful. That's the Uncle Tom's book, because you're so into it. And then boom, he dies, he's whipped to death. And immediately, when you read the book, you hate Simon Legree. And in this time when slavery was the thing, the people read the book and immediately hated slave owners. And so the book actually made people feel things. It was such a well-written book that it caused people to hate slavery. It causes people down south to hate Harriet Beecher Stowe for writing the book, because now all the slave owners down south are being looked at by people like their Simon Legree. And so this book is one of those. These are all little straws on the back of this camel until we're going to have that camel's back break and we have to go to war. So all these things just keep leading up to the Civil War. Then you're going to have things like the Ostend Manifesto. It's not in your notes right there. And we will go over the Ostend Manifesto tomorrow. Actually, it's in about 10 seconds, but that's for me. But for you, tomorrow. So, all right. See you then.